Somewhere in Siberia, about 14,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers did something strange. They took a wolf pup, an animal built to rip apart flesh, an animal every survival instinct should have told them to kill or avoid. And they let it live by their fire. That decision seems small, but it was the first thread in a much bigger story. A story of dozens of species that humans tried to tame, most of which failed completely and vanished. Foxes, zebras, antelope, even, according to some evidence, hyenas. We only remember the handful that worked: dogs, cats, horses, cattle, because the rest disappeared from the historical record along with the animals themselves. So here's the real question. Why did early humans try to domesticate almost everything around them? Why did the vast majority of those attempts fail? And what made a tiny number of species, including some now extinct, succeed just long enough to change the course of human history? Let's start with what domestication actually is, because most people get it wrong. Taming an animal is not the same as domesticating it. If you raise a wild fox from birth, you can tame it. It will accept you, tolerate handling, maybe even seem affectionate. But that fox's offspring will be wild again. Domestication is different. It's a genetic change across generations produced by selective breeding that reshapes a species' behavior, biology, and temperament permanently. A tamed animal is an individual that trusts you. A domesticated animal is a population that has been biologically rewired to live alongside humans. That distinction matters because it explains why so many ancient domestication attempts collapsed after a single generation. People weren't failing to tame animals. They were failing to breed the wildness out of them fast enough to keep the arrangement alive. Now, picture the Ice Age world these attempts happened in. Around 15 to 10,000 years ago, humans were surrounded by megafauna we'd barely recognize today. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, aurochs the size of small trucks, wild horses that looked nothing like the animals we ride now, and nearly every group of humans on every continent ran the same experiment. Capture young animals, raise them close, see what happens. Take the aurochs, the massive wild ancestor of modern cattle. Early farmers in the Fertile Crescent captured aurochs calves repeatedly. Most of those attempts ended badly. An adult aurochs was aggressive, unpredictable, and physically capable of killing a person with a single charge. It took thousands of years of selecting only the calmest individuals, generation after generation, before the population that would become cattle was stable enough to trust near children. The wild aurochs itself never fully lost its dangerous edge. And it eventually went extinct in the 1600s, hunted and outcompeted by the very domestic cattle descended from its calmer cousins. Now think about horses. Long before the modern horse became humanity's transportation network, there were other equine species people tried to bring into camp, zebras among them. Zebras look like they should be easy. They're horse-shaped, they graze the same way. They even herd. But zebra domestication attempts across centuries in multiple parts of Africa all failed. The reason comes down to something almost invisible: temperament under stress. Zebras have a dramatically stronger flight response than horses. They kick with far more precision and force, and critically, they don't form the same kind of dominance-based social bond with a human handler that horses do. A horse, cornered, tends to submit to a stronger, calmer presence. A zebra, cornered, tends to fight. And it fights better than almost any predator wants to deal with. Every attempt at large-scale zebra domestication in recorded history has failed for exactly this reason. This is where the story gets interesting because it means domestication isn't really about which animal is smart, or strong, or useful. It's about which animal has the right psychological wiring to begin with. Scientists studying this later gave it a name: the tameness threshold. And one of the most famous experiments in modern biology proved just how narrow and how fast that threshold can be crossed. In Soviet Siberia in 1959, a geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev started breeding silver foxes. Not for fur, not for looks, for one trait only: calmness around humans. Every generation, he selected the least fearful, least aggressive foxes and bred them together. Nothing else. Within just a few generations, something remarkable happened. The foxes didn't just get friendlier, their bodies changed. Ears went floppy. Tails started to curl. Coat colors shifted to patches of white. Skulls became slightly rounder. Belyayev hadn't just selected for tameness, he'd accidentally triggered a whole cascade of physical traits, all linked to the same underlying biology, the same hormonal and developmental pathway. It turns out that when you breed for calm behavior, gentler physical features often come along for free because they're controlled by overlapping genes. This experiment gave scientists a working theory for how wolves became dogs in the first place. Not through humans deliberately selecting the friendliest wolves like some ancient breeding program, but through a much messier accidental process. Wolves that could tolerate proximity to human camps got access to food scraps. The ones too aggressive or too fearful stayed away or were killed. Over many, many generations, the wolves hanging around humans were, without anyone planning it, the calmest ones. And calmness bred calmness, until an entirely new species emerged that looked and acted differently from its wild ancestor. Dogs weren't built, they basically built themselves, using humans as an environment. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. For every wolf-to-dog success story, there were far more failures we've simply forgotten because the animals themselves are gone. Ancient peoples in different parts of the world tried this same experiment on gazelles, on various species of wild sheep and goats that never became livestock, and, based on bone evidence at some sites, possibly even on young hyenas and wild cats that didn't survive into any modern lineage. Most of these animals had one fatal problem: they never crossed the tameness threshold fast enough. Either their flight response was too extreme, their aggression too unpredictable, or their social structure too incompatible with taking orders from a different species. And crucially, if a population of wild megafauna was already being hunted to extinction by humans at the same time someone was trying to tame it, there simply wasn't enough time left to breed a docile version before the wild population disappeared entirely. This is the piece that ties it all together. Successful domestication wasn't really about which animal was most useful to humans. It was a race against a clock that most species lost. You needed an animal calm enough to breed selectively, social enough to accept a human as part of its hierarchy, and, this part is easy to forget, surviving in large enough wild numbers to give humans centuries or millennia to run the experiment. Mammoths were intelligent, social, even had matriarchal herd structures a lot like elephants, theoretically excellent candidates for domestication. But their populations collapsed under a mix of climate change and human hunting long before any stable taming process could take hold. The species that could have become humanity's ultimate labor animals simply ran out of time. So the animals we call domesticated today, dogs, cats, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, aren't the animals that were most useful, or smartest, or strongest. They're the tiny surviving fraction of a much longer list of species humans tried to bring into their world. The rest of that list is mostly invisible now, buried in bone fragments and half-finished archaeological puzzles. The almost tame gazelle, the almost tame wild ass, the zebra that never gave in, the mammoth calf raised by a fire that never got the chance to pass anything on to a second generation. Which brings us back to that Siberian wolf pup by the fire, 14,000 years ago. It wasn't chosen because it was special. It was chosen because out of everything wild that shared that landscape with early humans, it happened to sit right on the edge of a threshold almost nothing else could cross. Calm enough to stay, wild enough to survive, and lucky enough that its species didn't disappear before that calmness had time to spread. Everything else we now call domesticated followed roughly the same accidental formula, and everything that didn't make it across that threshold in time is the reason the modern world doesn't include tame zebras, pet mammoths, or a hyena curled up at the foot of your bed.